Well, good afternoon to all of you. I join in welcoming you to the conference and for visitors to St. John's College and to Santa Fe. A couple of brief announcements before I introduce our speaker. Tomorrow, we're moving the time of Professor Gan's talk on the emergence of liberal education and classical studies in China to 10:45 to 12 instead of 12:25. And then lunch will be free. Lorraine Pangl was unable to attend due to circumstances beyond her control. But it means a little break tomorrow at lunch. This is a packed agenda. I applaud your stamina. But there's also another event tomorrow at lunch. Dan Marr from Assumption College, whose paper was read yesterday in the panel on underpinnings of an education in the classics, his paper, Teaching Philosophy in College, The Effectual Truth. He was delayed, but he's with us now. So tomorrow during lunch from 12:30 to 1:30, he and others from that panel will gather for lunch in the private dining room in the dining hall from 12:30 to 1:30. So anybody's welcome to join that conversation, whether you attended that panel or not. Finally, after this session at 1:30, Professor Delbanco will be available in the hall to sign books and answer further questions if you're interested. I'm pleased and honored to introduce Andrew Delbanco. Professor Delbanco is the Director of American Studies at Columbia University, where he's been the Julian Clarence Levy Professor of Humanities since 1995. Professor Delbanco has earned numerous honors and awards, perhaps the most significant being the 2012 National Humanities Medal, conferred by President Obama. Professor Delbanco has published extensively on American literature and its history and context, including work on religion in America, Lincoln, Melville, and Emerson, and including his important 2005 book, Melville, His World and Work. He has also published valuable studies of the history and philosophy of American education, notably College, What It Was, Is, and Should Be, published and widely reviewed in 2012. I heard Professor Delbanco speak on the themes of that book on the heels of its publication. I was struck by his erudition, but also by his wit, and by the blend, a too rare blend, of a warm zeal for the humane ends of a liberal and literate college education, together with a sober realism regarding the endless flux of cultural and political realities in which such an education exists and must find its home. He earned further credibility with me by having one reference to St. John's in the index of his book on college, which takes us to a passage in which it is said that St. John's almost alone, I've got to stress the almost with this crowd a little bit more than that some, almost alone has resisted the elective system introduced by Eliot at Harvard. Well, that is catnip for any true Johnny, and it has threatened my objectivity regarding his work. Since then, I've read that fine book on college cover to cover more than once in order to better understand the context in which our educational institutions find themselves. Professor Delbanco will speak this afternoon on the question, does liberal education have a future? Please join me in welcoming Andrew Delbanco.
Thank you very much, Walter. And like everyone else, I'm really delighted and honored to be here. I have to tell you that when I go to campuses where I've never been before, I sort of wander around and look for iconic structures or suggestions of what the place is all about. And I think I found that today. Down the hall here, there's a gentleman in bronze, right, who's fast asleep, looking like he will never wake. And the title of the sculpture is After Lunch. So thank you for slotting me into this particular slot. Walter and I sort of made a pact that I would try to speak relatively briefly. I haven't timed this. I might have some notes, but they're totally covered with responses to what I've been hearing, so they'll probably be pretty useless. That I would speak maybe half an hour or so, and with deliberately vulgar informality, so that we can have time to talk. Now, it has struck me, listening to the very excellent presentations that I heard today and yesterday, that there's a certain challenge in a conference like this. That is to say, everyone here is, as it were, we've all drunk the Kool-Aid or been received into the church, depending on which metaphor you prefer. And so we might need to be reminded that there's a big world out there where perhaps the communicants and believers are not so numerous. And I want to try to keep that world in view, and I want to talk a little bit about institutions as well as ideals. Now, I want to begin. I don't usually show pictures, but I've got two just to get us started, to sort of orient ourselves and see if this works. All right, there it is. So this picture was, if not the last, one of the last paper copies of Newsweek magazine before it went digital. And, you know, we may have strong opinions about Tina Brown, but she has a sense of, you know, what's on the public mind. So she put this question screaming out from the cover of the magazine: is college a lousy investment? It's a little blunt, but I think it's fair to say that this is a question in one form or another on the minds of a lot of people. The parents of our students, those of us who are parents, and students themselves. I'm not here to lecture you about the student debt problem in our country or the fact that tuition has been rising faster than the CPI for more than a quarter century, but those are, as we say redundantly, true facts. And people are worried about why college costs so much and what they can expect in terms of a return on their investment. So it's an ugly question, but it's not an unfair question. What interests me about the cover, though, is sort of the visual surroundings of the question. We could do a little primitive iconography with this. So the first thing that jumps out at me is the grass. The grass looks fabulous, doesn't it? I mean, it looks like the fairway of a very expensive country club, and it seems to be saying, wait a minute, what are our colleges spending their money on? Are they spending it on amenities and luxuries? That's an implicit question, I think. Then we have this couple. They're on very good terms with each other. They look very relaxed as they're strolling toward this classroom building, and why shouldn't they be, right? Because everybody looking at this cover is thinking, great inflation. Doesn't matter what they do, they're going to get an A, right? Now, there's nobody else around, so it could be that they're late, or it could be that everyone else is still in bed. But it seems to me, in sum, this picture says to us, what college is basically is an expensive dating service for pampered students. That's actually a slander, I think, for most of our institutions. It's a very distorted view of what undergraduate education in the United States is all about. More than a third of undergraduate students in our country now are adults with families holding down one or more than one job, trying to get a degree at the same time, going to underfunded community colleges or public institutions with no amenities or luxuries whatsoever. But this is the public view. And I have to say one more thing about the picture. I showed it at a gathering of college presidents some time ago, and I'm embarrassed to say that one of those presidents is in the room, so she's heard this before. But when we got to the Q&A, a president stood up and said, "That's my college." So I was pleased because I really wanted to know which one it was. It was the College of Staten Island in my very own city. And then he went on to say, he said, yeah, my public affairs guy called me up and said, I got good news and I got bad news. The good news is we're on the cover of Newsweek. The bad news is we just became the poster child for everything that's wrong with American higher education. So there you have it. Now, so the cost problem is an anxiety, and image number 2, which landed in my room when I was visiting Professor Ricks's adopted city, presents a kind of an answer. And in fact, this is now 2 or 3 years old. Is this the college classroom of the future? some of us know that it's already the college classroom of the present. In some ways, I mean, there's some so-called colleges and universities, the for-profit sector, for instance, that conduct almost all their education, if that's what it is, online. But even in traditional brick institutions, as they've come to be known, students, as we well know, are online a lot. They're wired up 24/7. So I think one could say that this is sort of a picture of something, at least, some aspect of the present. Now, if we do the same kind of analysis of this picture, it seems to me it's projecting a lot of positive images. Now, this young man is in his pajamas. He's very relaxed, just like the other two. We have no idea what time it is. Could be 4 o'clock in the morning, could be 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He's going to college on his schedule. He's not paying any attention to the registrar or the classroom schedule or anything else. He's Asian or Eurasian, which is okay for me to say because my children look sort of like him. But I think there's an implicit, you're worried about those kids in Asia, right? Or you're worried about those rising economies, and in China they're building all these universities. So he's got a little bit of a threatening quality to him, but the rest of it sort of muffles that and moderates it and makes us feel okay. He's using an American product, right? An apple. He's eating a healthy breakfast, sort of high fiber cereal sprinkled with fresh fruit, unlike the chocolate chip muffin that I had at the Inn on the Alameda this morning. He's got a mug on the table that says Harvard, so he's got high academic aspirations, and he's left-handed, which it seems to me it's a compliment to those of you who are left-handed, and it's sort of meant to be an aspirational ideal for those of us who are right-handed, because but there are a couple of things about this picture that strike me as somewhat frightening, if they are indeed pictures of the future or even the present. The first, and I'll get back to that theme a little later, is that he is alone. Now, many young people of his generation, and maybe some people in the room will object to that statement and say not really, that he's leading a vibrant and vital social life through the virtual portal of that machine, but for people of my age, it's a little hard for us to quite imagine that. The other thing that strikes me about it is we have to acknowledge that he's going for his education into the same space where he goes shopping, where he seeks entertainment, and where, if we are honest with ourselves, most people go at least sometimes to take a peek at pornography. So one thing that this picture suggests, to me at least, is that the traditional boundary line between the campus, the college, the university, the place of learning, and the world of getting and spending, as it were, is being erased. Now, in some respects, I think that boundary line, that barrier, has been too impervious over the years. But we all know, I think, as citizens of academic institutions, that the pressures to sort of embrace the world are getting stronger and stronger all the time. Now, these pictures then to me, and I'm going to get rid of them now, these pictures speak to certain forces that are threatening to undermine, maybe even overwhelm, what we think of as the traditional American college, and I guess I could go out on a limb and say that here we are assembled at the most traditional of all American colleges. So in my thinking and in my little book that's been mentioned, I try to, for my own purposes, distill the essence of what the American college has been about, and I want to talk a little bit about that and see if we can't reach some conclusions about its prospects for the future. I go always for a touchstone to Herman Melville, who says, as you know, early in Moby Dick, through the voice of his, I'm not sure if he's a reliable or unreliable narrator, a whale ship was my Yale College and my Harvard. Now, what did he mean by that? Autobiographically, as it happens, he, like Lincoln, who was mentioned earlier, never went to much of a formal educational institution, and as it turned out, he was at sea, not just on whale ships, but on merchant ships and military ships for about 4 years, the traditional span of time that American undergraduates then and now spend in colleges. But I think he meant a number of other things, all of which still resonate for me with the purposes of our colleges today. The first thing, and this is the thing that more and more people think of first because of the facts, whether we like them or not, that we are living in a static economy, or if it's an expanding economy, it doesn't seem to be expanding very much for most of the people that I know trying to get started in life. The first thing that he got when he went to sea was some skills. He learned how to do things. In fact, he learned about things that he didn't even know existed before he went to sea. How to keep a ship afloat, how to keep it functioning, how to furl the sails, how to spy the whale and hunt it down and kill it and cut it up into commodities that could be taken to market. So I wouldn't, as John Agresta was saying this morning in a slightly different way, I wouldn't want to condescend toward those of our fellow citizens who feel that our colleges have an obligation to impart skills that their students can take out into the marketplace. We might not like it that way. I think it's fair to say that American businesses have essentially pushed down into the colleges the obligation of job training that they used to take as a responsibility for themselves. But that's the fact of life. And I think as educators, we need to contend with it. Now, he also he read a lot of books. The libraries of the ships that he served on were extremely well stocked. And he became educated in the traditional sense of reading a lot when he was at sea. He also meant that he experienced what we nowadays call, we use the buzzword, it's not my favorite buzzword, diversity. He experienced diversity. He lived in what was the closest thing to a racially integrated society in 19th century America, a whale ship. He met people, young men, who he would never have encountered if he had stayed in the Boston of his father's family or the New York of his mother's family. Young men of different religious origins and different races and different languages and altogether different attitudes toward the world. But he also meant, and anyone who has read Moby Dick would, I think, agree that this is probably at the top of his list, that whale ship furnished him with the opportunity for contemplation. You all remember the great chapter, The Masthead, which he gazes out onto the wide Pacific and asks himself those terrifying existential questions. What am I in this vast universe? What meaning does my life have? If it has no intrinsic meaning, then how might I give it meaning? And this is, I suspect, for many of us in this room, although as I paraphrase, I think of Professor Ricks's comment that his students tend to want to read things that tell them about themselves, and that's not the only way we should read, but it is a way that young people do read, I think. I think most of us in this room take seriously the idea that a college should be a place that furnishes this kind of opportunity for young people. It's not, of course, a uniquely American idea. Cardinal Newman has already been invoked, and I'm sure will be again at this conference. One of my favorite sentences, liberal knowledge, he defines as knowledge that stands on its own pretensions, which is independent of sequel, expects no compliment, refuses to be informed by any end or absorbed into any art in order duly to present itself to our contemplation. And I think Melville would have agreed with that sentiment. Another phrase that I often find creeping into my mind when I talk about this subject comes from the British philosopher Michael Oakeshott, who speaks about the undergraduate years giving to young people the gift of interval. The gift of interval. And my sense is that what we're contending with is that the possibility of an interval is becoming more and more squeezed, not just for our students, but for ourselves. I think often in this connection of my 5th grade social studies teacher. And this, I'll date myself here, we're going back to around 1961 or so. So we were reading a textbook and she was endorsing the view, and she said to us, the biggest problem that your generation is going to have, the biggest problem, is what are you all going to do with all that leisure time, right? Now, how many people do you know, I mean, let's have a show of hands. How many people in the room feel that that's your biggest problem? Let's know. Like somebody, I'd like to talk to you after, find out your secret. You know, this was the age where, you know, we had washing machines and color televisions and automatic transmission, and the futurologists were all saying this was the problem. Now we're carrying around these smartphones and we have all these communication devices that are supposed to save us time, but in fact, of course, they rob us of time. So the gift of interval is a very precious gift indeed, and it's one that I think all of us as educators need to find creative ways to provide for our students who feel more and more stressed. Now, if I want to continue with this quick enumeration of characteristics of what I think of as the true American college, I would go out on another limb and say that one of its distinctive features, it's not strictly an American idea, but it's been developed in America more fully than anywhere else as far as I can tell, is that students have a great deal to learn, not only from their professors or from the texts that they're reading or from the laboratories that they work in, but from each other. And this is in most of the world, I think, a rather strange idea. Not perhaps in the great ancient universities of England, but those great ancient universities never reached very many people by comparison to what we've tried to do in our country. It's a fundamentally Protestant idea as far as I can make out, and I try to make a case in my little book that our colleges are really emerged from the New England idea of the gathered church. That's a New England-centric view, I know, but there it is. Mr. Eliot's forebears would have and did subscribe to such a view. Now, what does all this mean concretely? What do diversity and the idea of lateral or horizontal learning as well as vertical learning, what does all of this mean concretely in our classrooms? You'll all have different memories in mind. When I talk about it, I think, for instance, of my experience when I was trying as a total non-specialist to teach the Iliad in our core curriculum at Columbia, which is, as you know, a mild-mannered version of your curriculum here at St. John's. Teaching the Iliad, and I had in my class a student who had been a paratrooper in Iraq. And several other students, in fact, most of the other students, whose closest encounter with war was watching some war films on the flat screen TV in their parents' home. They were reading different books. I don't intend to transmogrify here into Stanley Fish, but they really were reading different texts. And the class came alive when they started talking to each other. And they discovered a world of difference in their experience. More typically, when I teach in my American literature course, texts like Ben Franklin's autobiography or Abraham Lincoln's speeches, two men very much committed to the idea that America is about opportunity. America is a place where you don't have to be what your parents were. America is a place where you can be whatever your talent and determination will lead you to. If I have a student who's been flipping hamburgers at McDonald's every summer to try to help pay the tuition bill for the family, and another student who's been working on his or her suntan at the beach house in the Hamptons, they are also reading different texts. And it's very useful for them to talk to each other. Now, the third thing about American colleges, and here I think Mr. Jefferson has been invoked frequently, is probably the most articulate spokesman for this view, and I was very interested in a little bit of a debate this morning between Dan Cullen and Bill McClay and John Agresto about liberal education versus or complementary to civic education, but I am going to say that I'm a fan of civic education. I think the college classroom, when it works well, is the best rehearsal space we have for democracy. It's a place where students learn to speak with civility, to listen with respect, and most of all, they learn the difference between an opinion and an argument, which incidentally, it seems to me, is one of those places where the notion of a gulf between the sciences and the humanities could be made to disappear, since a good science classroom is certainly not interested in opinions, and a good humanities classroom should insist on arguments. There's a meeting point there. Most important, a good college classroom, I think, is a place where you find that you can walk in with one point of view and walk out with another, or at least with productive doubt about what you thought you were certain of. And I don't need to, this audience, I don't need to rehearse why I think it's important that we continue to think of education in these terms. We are all bombarded every minute of the day and night by claims such as healthcare reform is going to bankrupt the country, or healthcare reform is an overdue act of justice for our fellow citizens who could never afford to take care of themselves. Abortion is the work of Satan, or telling a woman that she can't make decisions about her reproductive life is a form of abuse. Charter schools are a violation of the public trust, or charter schools are the only chance we have to save a bankrupt K through 12 education system. The right to bear arms is the cornerstone of a democracy. It's the essential element of a free people. It's our best bulwark against tyranny. Or the founding fathers are not likely to have thought about semi-automatic weapons, and no civilized society could possibly think of imagining its citizens carrying them around. We could go on and on with such examples. The point is, we all have strong views on these questions, but I actually think they are hard questions, all of them. And wherever we are on the political spectrum, I suspect we can rather cordially agree that the discourse in our country about such questions is pretty low and could stand some elevation. And I think that if we give up on the idea of liberal education as in part civic education, we're not likely to do much to elevate the conversation. Now, another of the major challenges that confront us as educators committed to the idea of liberal education, is so obvious that I probably don't need to belabor it, is the stampede to the STEM fields. By which I don't mean in the slightest way to denigrate science or its byproduct technology. Some of my best friends are scientists. And indeed, in my experience, there are many more liberally educated scientists than there are scientifically literate humanists. So please don't misunderstand me on that point. But my point is that when public figures speak about education, whether they're on the left or the right, STEM education is almost a synonym for education at this point. How did this come to be? What accounts for this? Well, of course, there is the general perception that we are, in the global knowledge economy, we need a population that has the skills to compete with the rising economies, as I've already mentioned, in India and China. But there's something also intrinsic to scientific knowledge, and again, I want to make a distinction. I mean, I'm not speaking here of science as free inquiry or science as a mode of contemplation, which of course is what it is at its best. But science as it is understood as the sort of handmaiden of technology. That science has built into it a certain understanding of knowledge that people can grasp and appreciate and can see in the world around them. To illustrate this point, I like to invoke another Eliot, Charles W., who was some species of cousin of TS, who became president of Harvard after the Civil War and was the man responsible really for transforming that institution from a college into a university. And at his inaugural address, he gave a definition of what a university should be or what it should do. Its primary purpose, he says, is to store up the accumulated knowledge of the race, by which he meant the human race, so that each successive generation of youth shall start with all the advantages which their predecessors have won. Now, this is, to my mind, a tremendously powerful idea. This idea that we are capable of taking our understanding of the world to a certain point, and then when age starts to weaken us and death starts to creep up, we can pass the baton to the next generation so that they can start where we have left off. I call this rather disrespectfully the relay race theory of knowledge. We all know that it has a great deal of truth in it. Otherwise, how could we explain that a third or fourth year medical student at any respectable medical school today will know more about the genetic basis of disease, for instance, than the dean of that medical school would have known 25 years ago? Or how can we explain that a reasonably adept math student who gets a 5 on the AP and places out of elementary math and goes right into calculus can grasp a mode of thinking that in the 17th century was understood by only 2 people in the world, one of whom was Isaac Newton. When I visit campuses, I point this out to some students, and I say, now, does that mean if you did well in math that you're the next Isaac Newton? And we all hope they will be, but it doesn't mean that, right? It means they've got a good math teacher, they work hard, they've got the aptitude, they've got a text, they've got the Khan Academy to go to understand stuff. It's there for them. They don't have to invent it again. They don't have to start from scratch. Reinvent the wheel, as the phrase goes. We all know that this paradigm is responsible for so much that we value in the world that we inhabit. With your indulgence, I like to illustrate this for myself by reminiscing for a moment about my own father, who was born in the year 1909, lived a very long life, lived into the beginning of the 21st century, and would tell me that he could remember when the milkman came to his parents' home in a horse-drawn cart. And when the first telephone was installed in his house, this huge box that you could shout into, and then somebody on the other side of town would try to connect you with somebody else. And then after a while, you could talk to somebody in another town, and maybe even in another country. And when they put the cable on the bottom of the ocean, you could talk to somebody across the sea. He lived long enough to cross that ocean in a jet plane in a few hours, many times, to see human beings walking on the moon. Now, I told you when he was born, but I didn't tell you where or under what circumstances. He was born in Hamburg, Germany, and despite the Italian-sounding last name, he was born into a German Jewish family. So you all know what that means, that 25 or 26 years later, he and the family and many other families that were fortunate enough to have the means to do it had to run for their lives because the society with the most advanced technology and the most Nobel Prize winners descended into a barbarism that even the medieval poets could not begin to imagine. And he lived through a century in which more human beings were killed by other human beings than in all the centuries of human existence preceding combined. What does that mean? The honest answer is, I have no idea. One thing it means for me personally is that when I read Augustine on original sin, I find myself nodding my head a lot. But it certainly means that there are some forms of human experience, maybe knowledge, certainly history, that don't very comfortably fit into the progressive paradigm. And that presents a big problem, I think, for those of us who make a living such as it is, recommending the study of the humanities. We all know that it makes no sense to say that Joyce's Ulysses is somehow a more penetrating, deeper work about human experience than Homer's Odyssey, or that The Rite of Spring is somehow a greater or more advanced work than Bach's B minor Mass. Professor Ricks yesterday had made some lovely remarks about the question of essentialism, and then Wendy, before lunch, talked about that touching scene in the Odyssey where Odysseus has to pretend that he doesn't acknowledge the recognition by his dog. So we know, at least we know this about the essentialist question: dogs haven't changed, okay? Maybe we also know from the Odyssey that jealous husbands haven't changed. But I had this little epiphany. It shows how naive I was before I started teaching it. When I was teaching the Iliad, again, this was in the Richmond Lattimore translation, because I don't read Greek, to my students at Columbia, and we came to this passage in which he describes how the Trojan soldiers overrun their Greek enemies. They streamed over in massed formation with Apollo in front of them, holding the tremendous aegis, and wrecked the bastions of the Achaeans easily. And here came, for me, the goosebump passage. As when a little boy piles sand by the seashore, when in his innocent play he makes sand towers to amuse him, and then, still playing with hands and feet, ruins them and wrecks them. I think even the sociologists would accept this as a datum, right? That little boys on the shores of the Aegean did the same thing that little boys do at Jones Beach or Virginia Beach or anywhere else in the world today. I will not speculate on whether little girls do it too, because I'm mindful of the fact that when the former president of Harvard University went down that road, he lost his job. Anyway. So we know the difference, right? I mean, if you make a truth claim in the sciences, the first thing that happens is that one of your friends or peers in your own institution or another institution is going to try to replicate your findings in his or her laboratory. And then you can make some claim to having said something true. That's not the way it works in our business. In our business, the only experiment to which we can subject our truth claims is the experiment of our own lives. I have a colleague with whom I teach who said to our students a few weeks ago, and I loved it, he said, look, at the end of this course, we have to give you a grade. The proper grade for all of you is incomplete. And you should come back in 25 years to your reunion, and if we're lucky enough to still be there, then let's talk about your life, and then we'll give you a grade, right? That's, I think, something that we cling to as the reason for our vocation. Now, so I really am going to stop talking very shortly. We have a big problem, I think, to convey to people outside this kind of institution, this kind of room, why all of this matters. And I think we've been doing a pretty lousy job of it. We had all these deformations and horrors in the academic humanities in the 70s and 80s. They seem to be subsiding, so that didn't help. We're squeamish about making the utilitarian arguments, as John Agresto said this morning, and I think we probably ought to be more willing to do that. We ought to be not so panicky about counting majors. I mean, I saw the Harvard Crimson, which they still read out of old habit, that fewer than 10% of Harvard undergraduates are now concentrating, as they say in Cambridge, in the humanities. Fewer than 10%. That's pretty striking. But, on some other level, I say, so who cares? I mean, if they want to be neuroscientists or engineers, or whatever they want to be, the issue is not what are they concentrating in. The issue is whether they're reading some books and having some productive conversations and learning about different ways of looking at the world. So I think we need to get a little more flexible about the way we think of this. But at the end of the day, I think we're up against a problem that I revert to my Puritan friends to articulate. One of those 17th century ministers puts it this way: grace is such a mystery as none can read but they that know it. Which I take to mean you cannot explain the value of a liberal education to someone who hasn't had one. It's like, this is an old philosophical conundrum, right? How can you convey the taste of honey to someone who has never tasted it? We try, and we should keep trying, but we are up against it. I think what we need to do, and I think a lot of that's been going on at this conference, and I was very moved by both Christopher Ricks and Wendy Lesser this morning, we need to give witness to what the experience means to us. We need to show what it has done for us. I think of, at my university there was a great art historian, Meyer Shapiro, and to this day, alumni will talk about having gone to his lectures when he was talking about Cezanne's apples or whatever, and they would say to each other, whatever that guy is smoking, I want some, right? So we need to give witness. Wendy was a little bit of a prosecutorial witness this morning for a while, but there's a place for that too. And I think, I'm going to say one last sort of preachy thing, and then I'll shut up. Our instinct on how to do this is not always quite as good as it should be. There's a short movie that the American Academy of Arts and Sciences put out called The Heart of the Matter. I don't think they had the Graham Greene novel in mind. And they have these, celebrities talking about the wonders of the humanities. They have John Lithgow, the world would be less beautiful without the humanities. And they have Yo-Yo Ma playing a bit of a Bach chaconne and throwing his head around and obviously enjoying himself and playing beautifully. And then they have the ubiquitous Ken Burns telling us, I think that's really the wrong approach. I think it contributes to a public sense that we're condescending. There's some people who have had these experiences and it's a privilege and you should hope to be such a person. I think that's the wrong message. I think the witnesses who are much more effective are people who have had traumatic experiences in their lives, people who are facing desperate odds in their lives, returning veterans, people who have been in prison for many years, who find themselves nourished and indeed, in some cases, saved by the experience of contact with art or literature. And there are many such people, and there are some organizations that are serving them well and some institutions that understand that their obligations go beyond the students in their own classrooms. I think of the Bard College Prison Initiative, the Project Hope at Stanford University, the Clemente programs. I was reading a book by Earl Shorross about the Clemente programs, which he started, called The Art of Freedom. And he tells a couple wonderful stories. I'll just sort of close with these. One very unsophisticated woman reading Dostoevsky's Underground Man and responds to it. Oh yeah, I recognize this character. That's a real complainer, just like my mother, who wants attention and goes in and out of hospitals just to be noticed. There's a sort of wonderful, or a black woman who read excerpts from Mary Chestnut's diary. C. Vann Woodward was mentioned this morning by Bill McClay. C. Vann Woodward made the case that Chestnut's diary was really notes toward a novel. And this black woman is reading this diary by a white slave-owning antebellum plantation mistress and finds herself sympathizing with her and feeling the tension in this woman between her humane instincts and her sense of her position in society and what is expected of her by her husband and everyone else around her. It seemed like a pretty good example of the expansion of sympathy that Professor Ricks was talking about yesterday. I will close with that and just say that I think the faith of a liberal education is a faith that believes that you can't coerce anybody into it. You can only put in front of them the opportunity, but that everyone has the capacity to reach out and take that opportunity. That there's an incendiary capacity in every teacher and an inflammability in every student. You just have to keep trying until something connects, and it doesn't have to be literature or art. It can be science or history. Something can connect. I think that's the faith we need to evangelize, and I think that's the reason we should be defending our institutions to the death. Thank you very much. So I don't know how long I talk, but I think there's time for exchange, and this always makes me both comfortable and uncomfortable in that you know the choreography suggests that you have questions and I have answers, but that's wrong. Yeah.
I was struck in your discourse by two things. One, you talked about Melville and the education of the sailor and his ability to investigate himself in that passage on top of the masthead when he was alone. And then you had a picture of today's student who is studying alone at home. Do you see a parallel? Do you see an opportunity? Do you see a way through the computer to get that student to experience the same thing as the sailor in the masthead?
I should have brought my Emerson on solitude with me. I mean, being alone is crucially important, and finding a place of quiet and retreat is harder and harder. And, you know, I mean, I like to work in libraries, and I find that I'm constantly getting up and asking people to please stop talking or turn the music down. I mean, it's even spaces that were once understood by everybody to be dedicated to quiet so that people could be alone are no longer that way. Whether the solitude of the young man in front of the computer is likely to lead in that direction, I have my doubts. The true believers will say so, but I'm stuck with this idea that what's really going on there is the transmission of information, or perhaps training in certain kinds of mechanical mental procedures. But, you know, for me, the times that I felt that I was having a real educational experience were either alone with a book, or in a one-on-one situation with a great teacher who would ask me startling and challenging questions that he or she could ask me because they knew something about who I was, or who I imagined myself to be. So I have my doubts, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a future for online education. I mean, I think we better get used to it. It's here to stay, and we ought to make the best of it and figure out how to use it to our own advantage.
But does it fit with liberal arts education?
I haven't seen instances of it, so, I mean, you know, my teaching assistants, I teach a lecture course in American literature, and they do invite their students to put up comments and reactions to the readings of the week, and then the students can talk to each other virtually before they get together in class. And they say that sometimes that makes for a livelier class. It's a version of what people now call the flipped classroom, that some of the activity can happen before the group converges on the same physical space, and then you can begin at a point which is already more advanced than you might have been able to do otherwise. So I'm open to the possibility. I don't do it myself. I teach exactly the same way I've always done, which is, you know, there it is. Yes?
Yeah, one of the arguments I encounter among colleagues is the stance that it's unethical to somehow tell a student they have to take a certain set of courses. And the notion that choice, the elective system, is really more ethical because they shouldn't have to go through the discomfort of some awkward discussion where they think they have to talk, and they shouldn't have to go through this discomfort to talk with a bunch of people about something that they don't agree on, and why is that good? Tough sell, but I want to get...
There's so many things to say. I mean, we have the perennial battles at Columbia over the compulsory core, which occupies a small fraction of the student's obligation compared to what you do here at St. John's. And it used to be an ideological battle. A certain faction of the faculty regarded as retrograde and Eurocentric and so on. That has kind of subsided. I think one of the turning points, one of the favorite moment for me at Columbia was when a group of faculty who were very adversarial toward the core convened like-minded colleagues and students who they expected to also, fetch a lot about the core. We don't want this. So a young African-American student with dreadlocks and the whole thing came to the microphone, and they, I could see this guy's got to really lay into it. And he says, listen, he says, whatever you do, don't mess with my man Thucydides. Because this guy really understands about power. And that's what, so that was the end of that movement, right? So that's one kind of counter-argument. But, there's so many, I don't know St. John's, but for the Columbia students, it's invariably the case, they love it in retrospect. And they love it because it gives them a frame of reference for everything else that they do. It gives them a sense of commonality with all their fellow alumni. My wife tells a wonderful story about a student of hers who went out to work and teach for America at a very, very tough school in Oakland, California, I think it was. And she was totally overwhelmed by the size of the class and the misbehavior of the students and everything else. And she had a classmate, a Columbia classmate, who lived on the other side of town, and they were both really losing it. And they said, you know what, let's get our books from our core courses, have our parents ship them, and on the weekends we better reread them and just talk. And it got them through the experience. So, but this is a form of, what you need is for people to see this happening for young people. I'll tell one other self-serving pitch.
It's a giving witness.
Yes, giving witness, exactly. And so, I direct this program, and one of the things we do is in the summertime with a teacher who Bill knows very well, a very gifted teacher, who's the administrative director of our core. He teaches a short seminar for gifted high school kids from very tough backgrounds who come from families where no one has ever gone to college. And they read Plato and Aristotle and Locke and Jefferson and Lincoln and all the way up to Martin Luther King and W.E.B. Du Bois. And they have the most unbelievably transformative experience you ever would want to see. So I mentioned this to somebody I had gotten to know a little bit, Frank Bruni, who writes a column for the New York Times. I said, hey Frank, why don't you come up and watch this? And he came up to this class, and bless him, he wrote a column about it, and said, this is real education, and it gives the lie to the notion that these books belong to this group or that group, or so you need to see it. You need to see it. You need to walk into a classroom and see it happening, and then the doubts begin to evaporate. It's very hard to do that in advance, though, for 18-year-olds. Yeah?
Yeah, I was wondering as a follow-up, is maybe part of the difficulty in the fact that liberal education, in some sense, is free that terminology doesn't make sense for white affluent Americans who think they are free. It's already, why do they need free? Electives are an expression of this freedom. Do you have any thoughts on how to
Well, I just got finished teaching Walden, in which Thoreau says, I went to the woods to live deliberately, freely, from freedom. And there's that passage in there, and I sometimes think he had Marx in mind. He says, I'm writing this for those who are, I can't remember quite the phrasing, in golden or silver fetters, but they don't know it. That's the case you have to make, and some of them find it out. My favorite, forgive me for the free association again, actually Thoreau is not a writer who's very close to my heart, but I was teaching that book one year, and a young woman in the back of the class who hadn't said anything the whole semester finally said something, and I was delighted. And she said, "I can't stand this writer. This guy drives me crazy." And I said, "Great, why?" She said, "He makes me feel like I shouldn't like my things." I like my things, she says. This was long. She had a big stereo in her room, and a color TV. The kind of, you got a hernia if you carried it around. And she, of course, she was going to be an investment banker. She became a teacher, and I think her parents probably took a contract out on me. But, so. You can't tell them. Look, well, one thing you can tell them is that, look, you came to St. John's, these are the books you're going to read. If you didn't want to read these books, you could go someplace else. And that's what I tell the students at Columbia. Now, we have a problem because of the commodification of everything. We now have students who apply to Columbia and Brown. Brown's a great institution, but why would anybody have the dual aspiration of going to either Columbia or Brown? The answer is because they're both prestigious, not because they have given any thought to what kind of education they want to get. But by and large, our students, and I'm sure that's true of your students here at St. John's, are there because they know this is what they're going to get. So we're very, very lucky. It's the rest of them out there that have a problem. Yes?
I heard you speaking about how best to respond to critics of liberal education, and you suggested that one way that we've done it is not really the best way. You suggested that we should point to people who have gone through trauma or people who have a hard time rather than people who are very comfortable and just enjoying the rhapsody of their experience. But I'm wondering if there's any criticism that's associated with that you think is important to take up and to take to heart.
Criticism of my problem.
Education. Yeah.
Is there any critique of liberal education that I think we should take to heart? Is that what your question? That we should take seriously?
Yeah.
Well, a serious critique. No, in the sense that I think for anyone who really understands what John and Dan and Bill were talking about this morning, it seems that it's a kind of, the only critique of that kind of education is a totalitarian critique, right? We don't want citizens who think for themselves. We don't want people who feel that they have the right to seek the fulfilled life, or a life of flourishing, or to pursue happiness. That's one kind of critique, which is why it's slightly interesting to me, I don't know much about it, that there seems to be a sneaking interest in liberal education emerging in China at the moment. I think mainly because they seem to think that they've got good technicians but not very creative scientists, and this might be a path toward creativity. So I don't think there's a substantive critique of the real thing. I think there's an understandable anxiety on the part of people who are making a big investment going into a lot of debt in college and say, well, it's all fine and dandy, you want my kid to be an English major, but all his friends are unemployed. We can't afford that. That is a problem, and we need to respond to that. And I think one way we can do that within our institutions is, as I said earlier, try to fight less for those hiring lines in the English department that are key to how many English majors there are, and try to have dialogue between, say, the English department and the engineering school, where there are a lot of creative people who are going to build things and create the world that we're going to inhabit, who would do very well reading some of the books that we care about. The professional schools are starting to figure this out. Medical schools have vibrant programs in what they call medical humanities. Business schools, notice we got some ethical issues, and so they're starting to develop court. And so I think, we need to get out of the sort of the academic boxes that we grew up in, because the next generation of students don't want to be in those boxes. I don't know if that's useful. Georgia. This is the president who embarrassed me. After my death, the former president of Kenyon College.
I would like to say what you just said. There is no critique. Really, it's violent, right? And as you know, this is the cause for the liberal arts education. Here's the one that bothers me the most. And so, It's a great place.
That's a real tough one.
How do we respond? And we talk about the ability to be thoughtfully, to make thoughtful judgments, ethical standards, et cetera, et cetera. We can't point to that as well as, let's say,
Yeah, listen, it's a great point. It's one that has bothered me all my semi-adult conscious life. I mean, right? You know, wasn't Fort Wengler conducting the Berlin Philharmonic when the Russian guns were firing on Berlin? How do you put those two things together? That's a little extreme example, but you know, the best I can do with it is that a real liberal education, one of the things one should gain from it is some humility. And a lot of the public figures you have in mind seem to be a little short on that commodity. I think it's also true that our measures of academic adroitness or talent are sorely lacking, right? I mean, we sort, our elite institutions are sorting people by their performance on standardized tests and so on. Those tests don't measure, they measure a certain kind of merit, but they don't measure honesty, courage, stamina. I mentioned humility. They don't measure any of those things. I mean, I have a friend who's a carpenter, a very wonderful carpenter, didn't go to get much college. And he told me when his father was dying, his father had served in the Second World War, he was going through his desk and he came on this medal and a citation with it, you know, for bravery in the face of intense enemy fire. And it said he had crawled out of his foxhole under a hail of bullets to drag a wounded comrade back to safety. So my friend went to his father and said, you know, Dad, you never told me about this. Why did you do that? Why did you do that? And his father says, son of a bitch owed me $50. Now, you can't measure that on the SAT, right? So we need to start by recognizing that, and you know. So I guess what I'm saying in a long-winded way is I don't think those folks are really liberally educated. They went through the motions, they got the credential, but they didn't really get it. Yeah.
The largest criticism I receive for being a student of liberal arts comes not from people who really understand what it is, but from people who look at it simply on a cost-benefit proportion and say, well, what do you do about this? And you touched briefly on that, but more in general, these people are also tend to be engineers, pharmacists, the kind of people who are very suspicious of any kind of religious-sounding rationale. And a lot of the rhetoric I've heard here today and yesterday speaks to that. And I understand that being, 3 years into this education. But how do you respond to other people who are going to be inherently suspicious of that kind of a rhetoric?
Are you saying that you're hearing an undercurrent of a sort of liberal education as a sort of secular faith, and that makes the pharmacist nervous?
Yes.
Well, so don't talk about it so much. Just talk about it with your co-religionists. I don't mean to be flippant about it, but to go back to the first part of your question, I mean, there are, Georgia would know better than I do, there are some good data that show, for instance, that the purest form of liberal education, this is right here, but residential liberal arts colleges, right? And everybody's rapping against them, but they have very good track records in placing their graduates into the professions and into science, because they get much more attention from their science professors than students in big research universities. And I think there's evidence that, I hate to go there, but a few years out, their earnings are robust compared to people with vocational degrees. So you can make those kind of arguments. And everybody every business person does know They want people in their company who can think and who can imagine alternatives and solutions to problems, right? So we shouldn't be afraid of that kind of utilitarian discourse. It's true.
If I could just follow up on that question. I thought I heard you say, maybe I'm wrong, I thought I heard you say very starkly that you can't convince someone about the value of liberal education if that person hasn't had one. And I thought part of that question was, it's easy to talk about the value of liberal education with those who already recognize it. Do you really understand my statement that someone who doesn't already know about it can't have access through someone else's,
Well,
pedagogy or persuasion?
I guess I would say that if this young man who's here and takes a position with an employer who is skeptical about liberal education, the best way you can just refute his skepticism is to perform well, which you will in that context. And then maybe you'll start to believe, okay, I'll hire somebody else from St. John's in a few years, right? Well, I may have misspoken. What I meant to say is I don't think you can, even if you can convince him of that, unless you can get him to join your reading group, which might be an interesting thing to do, I don't think you can convey the excitement. I mean, you know, if they heard Professor Rick's reading yesterday, and they were a certain kind of person, they might have had that sort of Meyer Shapiro experience. I want to be able to experience the poem the way he's experiencing it. And I was very moved, by the way, what you said about your brother and his relation to poetry being different from those of us who are professionals. So this is a spectrum here. What I'm really saying is let's not be condescending toward those who wonder what it is we're excited about. Let's just show why we're excited. Yeah.
You said you thought some of the students who went on to make certain morally dubious decisions who had gone through a liberal arts program and actually received a liberal arts education. So I was wondering, when I'm dealing with my students, how do we ensure that they're not going through the motions? Do you have thoughts on what it looks like to make sure they're engaging that sort of study?
Wow. My teacher and mentor, whom I greatly loved, would say that's why we have oral exams. Because that's when you can tell not just if they have the words, but if they have the music. In other words, he was thinking in terms of the profession of faith, right? You can tell if they're going through the motions or not when you get them one-on-one and, you know, talk to me about Paradise Lost. See how they talk. Thank you all very much.